I'll get it set up.
We want to start this evening with our land acknowledgement. We, the Agnus Dei Lutheran Church faith community, acknowledge that we gather each week on the traditional homelands of the Puyallup people, a Coast Salish Lusutchid speaking people. The Puyallup people have lived among these shores for thousands of years, faithfully stewarding these lands and waters as they continue to do today. The earliest native residents, a branch of the Swiftwater people, the Shrobops, called this land Twakut, meaning where deer run, and their longhouse was within walking distance of this church. This land acknowledgement is one step toward engagement and true solidarity with the Puyallup tribe. We commit to uplifting the voices, experiences, histories, and concerns of the Puyallup and all Indigenous peoples, and to being good stewards of the land and water which surrounds us.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks for being here. My name's Soong-Chan Rah. I had the privilege of 4.5 years ago meeting Mark Charles at a conference in New York, the Revolutionary Love Conference. And he shared on the Doctrine of Discovery, and I learned a lot that I had no idea about the Doctrine of Discovery or of our Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and it led me on a continuous study, which has kept me in track with following Mark for all these years since that time. Mark is a very knowledgeable, but has a sense of understanding. I always learn something. He does his second cup of coffees, tries to get them in once or twice a week, and I learn from those, and he's sharing what's going on. I listen to him as he talks about when he was running for president as an independent in 2020, and just his way of looking at things were inspiring. And so we were fortunate and lucky enough that Mark was going to be in town this weekend anyway. And so we were in contact with him, and we've got him here to share with you all, and do appreciate all of your coming.
Now is it on? Okay, great. There we go. Now let me get this set up, and then we should be good to go. Just a second.
And while we're waiting for a second, afterwards, Mark's got some of his Unsettling Truths books for sale in the back. So feel free to look at them and purchase them. There are coffee and tea and some cookies that are back there as well, if you need a little refreshment while you're here. Only tea. Oh, okay. Well, caffeine short and hot cocoa.
Okay. Just a second. There we go. Well, Yat Mark Charles Yinishya, Sin Bake Dana Nishle, the Toy Higlini Bashichin, Sin Bake Dana Dashiche, or Toruchini Dashanala. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans, or make trilineal as a people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Tsin Beke Dina Nishle. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsin Beke Dina, and my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totochitni, which is the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I'm so grateful for the land acknowledgement that you gave earlier. It is very important to understand that these lands were not discovered, right? In the book I wrote, I co-authored Unsettling Truths that we have available in the back. The first sentence of the first chapter says, you cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. And we need to keep that in the forefront of our minds all the time. These lands were not discovered. There were nations and peoples living here long before Columbus got lost at sea. They were hunting here, fishing here, farming here, raising their families here and burying their dead here. And many of these nations are still here. It's important to acknowledge these nations, and it's important to walk humbly on the lands that they have been stewarding for hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of years. So I'm a dual citizen of the United States and the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation is in the Southwest, in the Four Corners area of the country. And I moved from there to Washington, D.C. I moved there about 10 years ago with my family. My people call Washington, D.C. Washington. It's the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And the Piscataway are the hosts of the lands where I'm living now. And so I always like to honor them wherever I travel and acknowledge them as the host peoples of the land where I'm living today. But I'm excited about this next hour or so. We're going to be able, hour and a half, we'll be able to spend together. I have to warn you, I'm probably going to offend everybody in the room at some point. I'm going to say something that you're like, oh, I don't like the sound of that, or that doesn't sound right with what I want to believe. And at times you may think I'm picking on you a lot and leaving your neighbor getting off kind of scot-free. Don't worry, I have a bipartisan critique. And so if you're squirming and your neighbor's not, just sit tight. It won't be too long until they're squirming just as well. So yeah, we're going to talk about a lot of things. The challenge is there's a lot of things in our country we don't know how to talk about. And the majority of that is our history. We don't know really how to talk about our history. So at some point during this lecture, you may want to stand up and walk out. At other points, you may want to throw something at me. Resist both those urges. Stay connected, because these are important things we have to learn how to discuss. And if we can have these types of conversations, we're going to have a much healthier community and a much better nation. I began this journey years ago when I moved with my family from the Denver, Colorado, where I was pastoring a church there called the Christian Indian Center. And we moved back to the Navajo Nation, where my grandparents were from and where I grew up in that area. I had never lived on the reservation before. My grandparents were both boarding school survivors. They went on to work for the missionaries. My grandfather worked as a translator, and he actually helped translate the Bible into Navajo. But because of that, they didn't live on the reservation. And because they were boarding school survivors, they didn't teach the language or the culture to my father, so he didn't know what to teach it to me. And so as I was becoming a leader within our Navajo community, especially in our church, I realized if I really want to engage in this type of work, I need to be back on the reservation. And so we moved from Denver, Colorado, back to the Navajo Nation. We moved to the most traditional place we could find. We were 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road. We lived in a one-room hogan, about 25 feet in diameter, had log walls and a dirt floor. We had an outhouse about 50 to 75 yards outside our house. There was no running water, electricity in that community. Our neighbors were rug weavers and shepherds. And when we moved there, I really wanted to understand the more traditional part of my culture and my people. And something my people have been doing for hundreds, thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of years is greeting the sunrise with our prayers. And so I began that tradition. I began that discipline when I moved there. Wake up every morning, go outside, and greet the sunrise with my prayers. Now, the sunrise is always beautiful when you see it on Easter morning or when you have an early flight and you're driving to the airport. But when you see the sunrise day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and eventually decade after decade, it does something really deep in your soul. When you see the sun rising every day, you see how it moves to the north and to the south to go with the seasons. You see how the rains come and the leaves turn color and the animals migrate along with the sun. And you see the way that these seasons flow one into another. And you see this happen season after season, year after year, decade after decade. It convinces you of many things, one of which is you are not in control. And the other is how incredibly loving and merciful Creator is. No matter what happened the day before, whether you did something horrible to your neighbor or your country did something horrible to the world, the next day the sun always rises. The next day we're given a new chance, a new opportunity to do better and to try again. In our Navajo tradition, we seek what's called hojon, our balance, our harmony. We talk about walking in beauty. There's beauty ahead of us, there's beauty behind us, there's beauty to our left and to our right, there's beauty above us and beneath us. And one of our goals is to walk in this beauty. And watching the sunrise and seeing the beauty and standing there with a heart full of gratitude, it teaches you something at a very deep level. I would honestly say that discipline of watching the sunrise every morning is one of the most transformational spiritual disciplines I've ever had in my life. And it is that discipline that has given me the strength and the courage to learn and to walk through and to wrestle with many of the things that I am working on today. Many of the things you'll hear in this lecture. After my presidential campaign, which failed, didn't bring about, not only did I not win, but it didn't bring about the dialogue I was hoping we would have as a nation. I realized I needed to kind of recover from that. And when I had moved to DC, it was much harder to see the sunrise. I was living in a concrete jungle, and the sunrise, I couldn't see it clearly from my house. And I wasn't watching it nearly as consistently as I was before we moved. And so when we, after the campaign was over and I was trying to recover from that, I decided that I needed to make sure I did this more frequently. And so I drove around the city to find the best place to watch the sunrise. And it was right along the Potomac River. This was COVID, so that my kids weren't in school, no one was going anywhere. So every morning I was able to wake up and drive 20 minutes to the Potomac River and watch the sunrise. And when I was on the reservation, every morning I watched the sunrise, I would take a picture of it. So if you go back over my Facebook page over the past 20 years, you will see hundreds, thousands of pictures of the sunrise that I shared every morning. And if you go to my YouTube channel today, you will see hundreds of videos of the sunrise that I film. I now live stream it when I watch the sunrise. And I do it for two reasons. A, because I want to share that beauty. But B, I realized it was watching the sunrise that gave me the courage to wrestle and deal with these things that I'm going to talk with you about tonight. And because the nation clearly demonstrated didn't want to have these conversations, I realized not only do I have to learn how to engage these conversations better, I have to disciple my country in how to watch the sunrise. And so by live streaming it, I can invite people to join me. And I can actually let people join me either live or watch it later. And as I travel around the country, I have many, many people come up and say, Mr. Charles, thank you for your sunrise videos. They are really inspiring and they're really encouraging to me. So I want to frame this dialogue in that. And if you buy the book Unsettling Truths, or if you have it in the introduction of that book, I have a whole section where I talk about my journey of watching the sunrise and what that's done to me spiritually. But so That being said, let's now go into and talk about what we call the Doctrine of Discovery. It says things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. This is a papal bull written by Pope Nicholas V in the 1400s. This papal bull, along with others written between 1452 and 1493, are collectively known as what we call the Doctrine of Discovery. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are less than human and their land is yours to take. So this is the doctrine that allowed European nations to go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people because they didn't see them as human. The same doctrine that let Columbus, who was literally lost at sea, land in what they called this new world and claim to have discovered it. Right? As I said earlier, the first sentence of the first chapter of our book says you cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. You can colonize those lands, you can steal those lands, you can conquer those lands, but you can't discover them unless your worldview, or better yet, your church, informs you that the people living there are not human. If you don't believe me, leave your cell phones, your car keys, your computers out, and I'll be happy to come by and discover them for you. Right? Clearly, this is not discovery. This is stealing. The fact that we call it discovery reveals our implicit racial bias, which is that the people who were living here were not fully human. Now, the challenge with this doctrine of discovery is what we've done with it as a nation. So in 1776, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he says to the colonists that are here that they no longer have the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upsets the colonists. They want access to those lands. So a few years later, they write a letter of protest. In their letter, they accuse the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. And they go on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th of 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the Founding Fathers used this inclusive term, all men, is because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. This makes our Declaration of Independence a systemically racist, sexist, it says men, not women, and white supremacist document that assumes the dehumanization of indigenous peoples. A few years later, our founders wrote another document. They begin this one with the words, "We the people, the United States," in order to form a more perfect union. This, of course, is a preamble to the Constitution. Now, if you read this Constitution, not even much further, just down to Article 1, Section 2. This is the section of the Constitution that determines who is and who is not a part of the Union, who is and who is not covered by this document. If you read Article 1, Section 2, the first thing you have to note is it never mentions women. Now, this is important because if you read the entire document, preamble down to the 27th Amendment, you'll find there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his. Who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by the document. There's not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. So we have to know Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? 1787, who's left? If you take away women, you take away natives, you take away African people, who's left? Well, that leaves white men. And technically, you had to be a landowner in order to vote. So here's just a few examples of the places where it says his. You can see during his time in office, he was elected. The president, he shall hold his office. We don't acknowledge this frequently enough. The purpose of the Constitution, the reason it was written, was not to give liberty and justice to all. It was to protect the rights of white landowning men. Right? So we act surprised today that women earn 60 to 70 cents to the dollar. This isn't surprising. The Constitution's working. We get upset that our prisons are filled with people of color. This is not surprising. The Constitution's working. People get outraged that the Supreme Court in 2010 sided with Citizens United and rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. This is what opens the door for super PACs that are unlimited support for candidates. This is not surprising. The Constitution is doing exactly what it's designed to do. It's protecting the interests of white landowning men. In 1823, we had a Supreme Court case. It was Johnson versus McIntosh. This is two white men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native nation. The other one got the same piece of land from the government. They want to know who owned it. The Supreme Court had to decide the legal precedent for land titles. Who had the right to sell the land, the native nation or the U.S. government? This is the John Marshall Court, largely considered one of the greatest Supreme Court jurists in our nation's history. And they had to make this decision. And so they ruled that it was discovery that gave title to the land. Now, because that might seem to possibly imply that natives might have some sort of agency or sovereignty over their land, which they were there first on, they had to clarify. And so they said, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. This case, along with a few others in the 1820s and 30s, create the legal precedent for land titles. This precedent and the Doctrine of Discovery are referenced by name by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. I have a TEDx talk online. It's called We the People, the Three Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History. It has about 300,000 views. It goes through these cases and other parts of the Doctrine of Discovery fairly accurately in about 19 minutes, or fairly comprehensively. And it's a great way to share with people just to give them a taste of what you're going to experience tonight. I want to talk about this 2005 case. So in the 1770s, the 1700s, the United Indian Nation occupied several million acres in what's now Central State New York. George Washington's administration reduced those holdings to a few 100,000 acres through treaties. And then they wrote a law saying that only the federal government could purchase these lands from the United Indian Nation. The state of New York continued to illegally purchase these lands until all the United's lands were bought up and they were removed from New York out into Oklahoma. In the 1990s, the United Nation came back into the New York state and they purchased some of their original lands. They bought them on the open market. They paid full price for them. And they wanted to reestablish their sovereignty over these nations. The lands they bought were within the city limits of the city of Sherrill. And the city of Sherrill wanted the tax revenue from the lands, which the United were not paying because they claimed sovereignty over them. So they sued them in federal district court. The federal district court ruled in favor of the United, so the city of Sherrill joined with the county and appealed to the Court of Appeals, and that decision was upheld. So they appealed a second time to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heard the decision heard the case in 2004 and issued their ruling in 2005. They reversed the decision of the lower courts. In the first footnote of the case, where they're establishing precedent, they mentioned by name the Doctrine of Discovery. They go on to argue that given the long-standing, distinctly non-Indian character of the area and its inhabitants, the regulatory authority constantly exercised by the New York State and its counties and towns, and the United's long delay in seeking judicial relief, we hold that the tribe cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty in whole or in part. They went on to write, and they reference another court case, another precedent, and said it is impossible to rescind the cession and restore the Indians to their former rights because the lands have been open to settlement. Again, that settlement was white settlement, and large portions of them are now in the possession of innumerable innocent purchasers. They went on to write and said, moreover, the properties here involved have greatly increased in value since the United sold them 200 years ago. Notably, it was not until lately that the United sought to regain ancient sovereignty over lands converted from wilderness to become parts of city like Sherrill. Now, if that argument sounds similar or familiar to you, it's because it's very similar to what John Marshall argued in 1823. Uses the same logic, the same argument, just does not use the word savages. So the court in 2005 concludes that we reject the unification theory of the lower courts, and we hold that the standards of federal Indian law, again, footnote 1, Doctrine of Discovery, and federal equity practice preclude the tribe, and now they get poetic, from rekindling embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. This is quite possibly one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. And it was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, this is shocking, right? Because the legacy of Justice Ginsburg was that she was a voice of dissent on a conservative Supreme Court fighting for the rights of the marginalized, which she was and which she did. But because to this day, land titles are based on the legal understanding that natives are savages, this makes white supremacy a bipartisan value, which Justice Ginsburg demonstrated quite clearly in her opinion in 2005. I want to go back a few years now to the 1630s. In 1630, John Winthrop, a Protestant pastor, was on board a ship. He was in what's now called the Boston Harbor. He was with a group of people here to plant the Boston colony. And he preached a sermon there titled A Model of Christian Charity. In his sermon, he referred to the people he was with as a city upon a hill. He's borrowing from the language of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, where he tells his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining their deeds into this dark world. He goes on in his sermon to exhort them in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. They should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. They should keep the unity of the Spirit within the bonds of peace. These are just your basic Protestant Christian exhortations. Now, at the end of his sermon, he does what many Christian pastors do, which is he tries to compel his congregants to heed his warnings or his teachings by quoting from the threats and promises of the Old Testament. And so John Winthrop decides to quote from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 30 is the passage in the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing on the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over and take possession of their promised land. And God's reiterating the threats and promises of the land covenant. If you obey me, I'll do these things to you. If you disobey me, I'll do these things to you. It says there, but if our hearts will turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river, but in his sermon, John Winthrop changes the word river to vast sea. Now, why would he do that? Well, they didn't cross a river, right? They crossed an ocean. So what's he saying? Based on the exhortations from the teachings of Jesus to be a city on a hill, based on the Old Testament land covenant with the people of Israel, they are standing on the banks of their promised lands, ready to go and take possession of them. Now, who's read the books of Deuteronomy and Jeremiah or Joshua? How are the people of Israel commanded to take possession of their promised lands? Yeah, Deuteronomy 20 says, however, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivitites, the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. See, promised lands for one group of people is literally God-ordained genocide for another. I call this sermon by John Winthrop the birth of the myth of American exceptionalism. The myth of American exceptionalism is not just that Americans are better than everyone at anything else. It's that we have a unique relationship with the divine. We have a special covenant with the God of Abraham. So this is the 1630s. This idea percolates for about 100 years. Mid-1700s, our nation begins moving westward. We go past the Mississippi River. We go past the Appalachian Mountains. End of the 1700s, we have the Second Great Awakening. There's this growth in churches, a renewal within denominations. Early 1800s, the notion of manifest destiny is born. The belief that this nation of white European Christian people have the God-given right to rule this continent from sea all the way to shining sea. Now, in my book, at this point, I go into several chapters, Soong-Chan, my co-author and I go into several chapters where we talk about the 18th century and all of the wars we fought. I don't have time to cover all that this evening. There's a lot of material we want to get through. But I want to convince you of how horrific this notion of manifest destiny was, especially for Native peoples. So I want to highlight just a few instances or a few people and instances for you. I've been told that the two hardest chapters to read in Unsettling Truths are chapters 9 and 10. Chapters 9 and 10 deal with the adage that says the victors write the history. Now, this isn't controversial, right? Most of us agree to this. If you win a war, you get to write about the war. That's just how things work. So what we do in chapter 9 is we speculate what would have happened if Nazi Germany had won World War II. How would their historians have recorded the legacy of Hitler had they won the war? Well, he'd be their greatest leader ever, right? Brought them from global obscurity to global dominance. How would their historians have recorded the Holocaust had they won the war? Well, we have Holocaust deniers today. Imagine if they won the war. What Holocaust? There was no Holocaust. What makes chapters 9 and 10 so controversial is we point out the fact that the United States of America has never lost a war that matters. We've never had a regime change. We've never been occupied. We've never been disarmed. We've never borne the scorn of the global community. We've won every major military conflict we've been a part of. Technically, the Korean War is not over yet. We pulled out of Afghanistan. We pulled out of Vietnam, but we didn't lose any lands there. We got a black eye maybe, but nothing major. And other than that, we've won virtually every major military conflict we've been a part of. As a result, we, and by we, I mean white landowning men, have been able to write their own history for the past 250 years. So what makes chapters 9 and 10 so challenging is we take the adage, the victors write the history, we speculate what Nazi Germany would have done to Hitler, and then we apply that reasoning and thinking to this man. Now, Abraham Lincoln is largely considered by consensus, and if you really want to know, by ChatGPT and AI, to be the greatest president in American history. And in fact, as race relations have gotten worse in the past couple decades, the stock of Lincoln has only risen. His monument is one of the most visited monuments in the nation. Republicans love to remind us that they are the party of Lincoln. They use Lincoln to rebuke Trump during his first campaign for president. And our nation's first black president, Barack Obama, was sworn into office with his hand on what? The Lincoln Bible. By and large, Abraham Lincoln is considered by the majority of Americans to be the greatest president in our nation's history. But because we have never lost a war that matters, because we have been able to write and record our own history for the past 250 years, we actually don't have a clue who Lincoln is. We don't know anything about him. So I want to introduce you to him. I'm going to introduce you to Lincoln the same way he introduced himself to the nation when he ran for president, or not for president, for the U.S. Senate in 1858. He was running against Judge Stephen Douglas. It was largely known at the time that Lincoln was against the institution of chattel slavery. But there was a debate going on regarding civil rights for people of color. And they wanted to know where he stood on that. And so during one of the early debates, and the debates back then weren't like the debates today. They weren't just a bunch of sound bites strung together. People usually slept well before the debates. They would give 3 speeches. Wow, Democratic Party here. Anyway, they would give 3 speeches. The first candidate would speak for 20 to 30 minutes. The second candidate would respond for 30 to 40 minutes, and the first candidate would come back for 10 to 15 minutes. 3 speeches. Early in these debates, this is what Lincoln said. I will say then that I am not, nor have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the 2 races from living together on terms of social and political equality. And insomuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. This is how Abraham Lincoln chose to introduce himself in 1858. Now, why would he do that? Why did he go out of his way to point out that he was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist? Well, remember in 2022 in our midterm elections, there was a Supreme Court case just before that, right? Roe versus Wade was overturned. As a result, every candidate had to take a position on abortion in that race. Doesn't matter what office you're running for, you had to take a side. Everyone had to pick a side in that 2022 midterm election. Well, in the 1858 midterm election was prefaced just a year earlier by another major Supreme Court decision, which was the Dred Scott decision, which ruled that our founding documents did not apply to people of color. And so during his introduction to a national audience, Abraham Lincoln was making very clear that he agreed with the Dred Scott decision and had no intention of extending civil liberties. Even though he wanted to end chattel slavery, he had no intention of making them equal or extending civil liberties to people of color. The book lays out a lot more arguments, because I know most of you are thinking, but Abraham Lincoln had a black friend. Trust me, he was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist until the day he died. And on top of that, he went on to lose that election in 1858, but 2 years later, he won the election to presidency in 1860. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed 2 bills. He signed the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. The Homestead Act allocated 160 acres to anyone willing to go west and homestead for 5 years. The Pacific Railway Act gave the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. These were in the spring and summer of 1862. In the fall of 1862, there was a very bloody war in Minnesota called the Dakota War of 1862. Lasted about 30 days, hundreds of casualties on both sides. End of the war, half the Dakota warriors fled north into Canada, the other half surrendered. Those who surrendered were immediately put into military tribunals. They're now being judged by the very same people they were just fighting on the battlefield. These trials were legal shams. They lasted a few minutes. They were in a language the Dakota didn't understand. They shared witnesses. End of these trials, over 400 of the Dakota warriors were sentenced to death. No one wanted to execute that order. Went all the way up to Lincoln. Even he couldn't bring himself to do it. But instead of ordering retrials, he just changed the criteria of what warranted a death sentence. Under his new criteria, only 2 Dakota warriors were scheduled to die. And he was afraid of what was actually happening, which was the settlers were going to rise up and begin rebelling because they were upset about this, which they started to do. So for a second time, he didn't order retrials. He changed the criteria again of what warranted a death sentence and landed on the magic number of 38. So the day after Christmas, 1862, Abraham Lincoln ordered the largest mass execution in the history of our country with the hanging of the Dakota 38. In January of 1863, I want to just read this. In the frigid dawn of January 29, 1863, Sagwitch, a leader among the Shoshone of Beaogi, our big river, in what is now Idaho, stepped outside his lodge and saw a curious band of fog moving down the bluff towards him across a half-frozen river. The mist was no fog, though. It was steam rising in the sub-zero air from the hundreds of U.S. Army foot soldiers, cavalry, and their horses. The army was coming for his people. Over the next 4 hours, the 200 soldiers under Colonel Patrick Connor's command killed 250 or more Shoshone, including at least 90 women, children, and infants. The Shoshone were shot, stabbed, and battered to death. Some were driven into the icy river to drown or to freeze. In February of 1863, Abraham Lincoln nullified the treaties of all the nations, the native nations within the state of Minnesota. In March of 1863, with no treaties and no new renegotiations, he ordered their removal. They were rounded up, put onto wagons, put into barges. They were marched and shipped out of the state into the Dakota Territory to land that was not sustainable for them and their size. This was a very unjust, very brutal, and very sudden removal. In the fall of 1863, General Carleton, one of Abraham Lincoln's generals in the Union Army in the Southwest, gave this order. He said, henceforth, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to the bush, Redondo, we will pursue you and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or move. There can be no other talk on this subject. Kit Carson and other Union Army captains went through the lands of my people. They burned our hogans. They killed our livestock. They burned our crops. And they hunted our people throughout the Southwest. In the Book of the Navajo by Raymond Friday Locke, he wrote, by the middle of December, most of the weak and aged had died. There is hardly a Navajo family that cannot remember tales of an aged grandfather, a pregnant mother, or a lame child that had to be left behind when the camp had to be quickly deserted. The patrols were not interested in taking captives. It was too much trouble to transport them back to the forts. Any Navajo they saw was shot on sight. Mothers were sometimes forced to suffocate their hungry, crying babies to keep their families from being discovered and butchered by an army patrol. They went throughout the Southwest and rounded up nearly 10,000 of my people and marched us down to Bush Redondo in southeast New Mexico. Hundreds of my people died of exposure and starvation along those routes. At Bush Redondo, D. Brown, in the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, wrote, it was a wretched land, they said. The soldiers prodded them with bayonets and herded them into adobe-walled compounds where the soldiers were always counting them and putting numbers down in little books. To shelter themselves from the rain and the sun, they had to dig holes in the ground and cover and line them with mats of woven grass. They lived like prairie dogs in burrows. Crowded together as they were, disease had begun to take a toll on the weaker ones. It was a bad place, and although escape was difficult and dangerous under the watchful eyes of the soldiers, many were risking their lives to get away. Nearly a quarter of my people died while imprisoned. They called it a reservation, but we all know what it was. It was a death camp. A death camp that was approved by Abraham Lincoln in 1864. In the spring of 1864, Abraham Lincoln signed the second half of the Pacific Railway Act. This doubled the land and the resources given to the Transcontinental Railway, and it gave the railway companies the mineral rights to the ground to financially incentivize them to work faster. On January 29 of 1864, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were on their treaty lands. They were waving a white flag of surrender and an American flag to show they were there peacefully. They were in eastern Colorado. A Union army led by a Methodist pastor came over the hill. The warriors of the camp were out hunting. It was early in the morning. The camp was filled with women and children and old men. And he ordered all of them slaughtered. The soldiers went through and killed hundreds of the Cheyenne Arapaho. And that night they paraded their genitalia down the streets of Denver in celebration of the massacre. 1 week later, after that massacre, Abraham Lincoln was giving his annual message. And he said 1.5 million acres were entered in under the Homestead Law, and the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific states by railway and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of success. Within 2.5 years after signing the first parts of the Pacific Railway Act and the Homestead Act, after the hanging of the Dakota 38 in 1862, the Bear River Massacre in 1863, the Long Walk in 63 through 65, and the Sand Creek Massacre in 64, Abraham Lincoln was quite confident that they were going to complete Manifest Destiny. Why, though? Why was he so confident in this? Well, this is a map of the early route to the railway. We had reached Omaha, Nebraska. We had to go through Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and come out near San Francisco. There was a northern route starting in Duluth, Minnesota, had to go through North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and come out near Seattle. And there was a southern route going through northern New Mexico, Arizona, and coming out near LA. After the removal of the Winnebago and Dakota from Minnesota, after the Bear River Massacre, which is literally a stone's throw from where the Golden Spike was eventually laid, after the Sand Creek Massacre in eastern Colorado and the Long Walk in the southwest New Mexico, you can say Abraham Lincoln had essentially just ethnically cleansed the northern, central, and southern routes of the railway. You see, not only was Abraham Lincoln a blatant, unapologetic, and self-proclaimed white supremacist, but he was one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. And just so you don't think it was only Lincoln, in 1851, Peter Burnett, who was the governor of California, this is just after the California Gold Rush, he gave this speech this statement in the State of the State address. He said that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct, must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying disease has broken out and we can't stop its spread, nor is he saying famine has hit and we can't stop it. He's literally saying we can't stop killing until we complete our manifest destiny. And again, remember, this is perfectly in line with Promised Land theology. Promised Land for one people is literally God-ordained genocide for another. Now I want to talk a moment about the challenge we face today as a nation with white Christian nationalism. There's a popular belief that white Christian nationalism is a partisan problem, and the Republicans have it. That's the belief, that's the consensus. If we could just correct their thinking or vote them out of office, we would not be a white Christian nationalist nation. If you remember back during the 2020 election, I was running for president then. We had some pretty horrific racial tension in our country. We had the public lynching of George Floyd. Do you remember Donald Trump's solution to that lynching? Do you remember what he proposed? perhaps maybe we might want to think about banning one or two types of chokeholds. Remember Biden's solution? We should train our officers, we need to train our officers to shoot people in the kneecaps instead of in the chest. That's what he said. They both got their wish in Jacob Blake. He wasn't choked, nor was he shot lethally. He was shot in the back several times. They both got their wish. Of course, it didn't solve the problem. It was still incredible, racially motivated injustice. The lynching of George Floyd led to protests all around the country, including where I live in Washington, D.C. Every day there was a protest going on in what's called Lafayette Park, which is right across the street from the White House. On the morning of June 1st of 2020, there was people protesting in Lafayette Park. And law enforcement went out that morning and they aggressively cleared the park, so it was empty. A few hours later, President Trump walked out of the White House, walked across the park, stood in front of the church across the street and held up his Bible, upside down at first, then turned it around, took a picture, and walked back. And he was immediately called out for exactly what he was doing, which is he was giving a dog whistle to white Christian nationalism. We all knew it. He wasn't kidding anybody. We knew exactly what he was doing, and it's because, again, most of our media leans to the left, including AP News, NPR, and the major networks. Most of our media leans to the left. And we all cried out that the Republican Party, led by Donald Trump, was endorsing white Christian nationalism, which they were, and which he was. But we saw it as a partisan problem. Now, Joe Biden was running in the same election in 2020, and he was promising to be the anti-Trump, right? He promised that he would not do his foreign policy over Twitter. He promised he would speak with a more complete sentence structure. He promised that he would bring dignity back into the White House. And he won the election. And he was tested a few months later. Because in early 2021, there was a terrorist attack in Afghanistan that took the lives of several U.S. service members. It was tragic enough that he had to say something. And so a few days later, he gave a speech. In his speech, this is what he said. To those who carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this. We will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay. I will defend our interests and our people with every measure at my command. Now, if you remember over the past 2.5 years, President Putin from Russia has said almost a similar thing if any NATO country puts boots on the ground in Russia, right? He said, if any country puts boots on the ground in my country, I will defend my homeland with every measure at my command. And we have been appalled. How dare you talk that way, Mr. Putin? You are a nuclear power. You are threatening nuclear war. How dare you arrogantly and consciously talk that way? But Biden spoke that way 3 years ago. And if I didn't tell you it was Biden, you all would have thought it was Trump because he speaks the exact same way. Trump and Biden actually talk very, very similarly when they feel threatened, either with their families or with their nations. They're not that dissimilar. Biden went on. He said, I want to thank the Secretary of Defense and the military leadership at the Pentagon and all the commanders in the field. There has been great unanimity from every commander on the objectives of this mission and the best way to achieve those objectives. Those who have served through the ages have drawn inspiration from the book of Isaiah, when the Lord says, whom shall I send and who shall go for me? And the American military has been answering for a long time, here am I, Lord, send me. Here I am, send me. In his first State of the Union, Joe Biden used the word sacred twice. He used it once in reference to the Capitol building. This is a sacred place to hold these speeches. He used it the second time when he talked about our sacred obligation to take better care of our veterans. I do not disagree. We have an absolute moral obligation to take care of those who fight wars on our behalf. But Joe Biden used the word sacred. Why bring the divine into this dialogue? Because Joe Biden believes the U.S. Army is the army of the Lord, responding to a prophetic call on par with that of Isaiah the prophet. If we think white Christian nationalism is a partisan problem, we are living in a news bubble. White Christian nationalism is a bipartisan, foundational level problem that we have been wrestling, and not even wrestling, we've been embracing for the entirety of our nation's history. It is something Democrats share deeply with Republicans. Again, most of our media leans left. They're not going to call this out. It destroys their advertising revenue. Fox News doesn't have the theological acumen to understand what he's saying. They're not going to say anything about it. But we have to be aware. White Christian nationalism is a bipartisan problem that has infected the Democrat and the Republican parties. And if we don't acknowledge that, we are never going to fix the problem. Joe Biden is every bit the white Christian nationalist that Donald Trump is. When I ran for president, I was and continue to be convinced the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. It's a conversation I would put on par with the Truth and the Reconciliation Commissions that happen in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. But I wouldn't call ours truth and reconciliation. Reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony. We're restoring something that was harmonious before. When you understand the Doctrine of Discovery, when you understand how this nation was founded, when you understand the foundational problems that we have as a country, we realize we're not restoring harmony across racial lines. We don't need truth and reconciliation, we need truth and conciliation. We have to form these relationships for the very first time. And I think we need this dialogue sooner rather than later. One of my favorite quotes is by George Erasmus. It's not his quote. He used it when he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Canada regarding their residential schools, similar to our boarding schools. The quote says, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where communities to be formed, common memory must be created." I love this quote. I think it gets to the heart of our nation's problems, especially regarding race, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers a mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. We have communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands and broken treaties, of slavery and Jim Crow laws, of segregation, mass incarceration, families being ripped apart at our borders. There is no common memory. And if we're honest, there is no point in US history where we've had healthy community across racial lines. That point does not exist. When I teach this history, I'm not trying to cancel white people. I'm not trying to guilt them, guilt you. I want to live in a nation that has healthy community. And we're not going to be able to do that until we can talk honestly about our history. This is why I ran for president in 2020. This is why I wrote the book Unsettling Truths. This is why I travel the country talking to audiences like this whenever I can. I want to do everything I can to build this common memory, to help move this conversation forward. We have about 10 more minutes. I want to end with some Q&A. But first, I want to talk to you for a few minutes about my next book. I'm actually writing 2 books. One I'm actually writing, the other one's just in the back of my head. The book I'm writing is called Decolonizing Faith. The book in the back of my head is called Decolonizing Health. Tomorrow night, I'm speaking at Rainier Avenue Church in Seattle at 6:30 p.m. And I'm talking for an hour and a half about decolonizing health. But I want to talk about decolonizing faith for a minute tonight. It's being written as a part 2 to Unsettling Truths. Not because it's a continuation of the story or even the history, but because I'm assuming people will understand the doctrine of discovery. I'm not going to repeat myself of what I said in Unsettling Truths. I'm going to build on what we said in the first book I wrote. In Unsettling Truths, we look at how the scriptures have been misused by the church and the nations to justify things like enslavement, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. So we critique the United States of America and many European nations for what they did and the way they colonized most of the world. But I was asked several times, why did we not critique the Bible? Right? You all saw the passage from Deuteronomy where God commanded his people to commit genocide. They said, why are you not critiquing that? I said, well, because I'm not going to question scripture right now. But the longer I wrestled with God and with this history, the more I realized I need to address that question. And so our decolonizing faith is looking, sorry, this is jumping off of my ear. Decolonizing faith is looking at how our scriptures lend themselves to a violent, abusive, and colonial worldview. I'm going to give you just a glimpse into what I'm doing. And for your information, on Sunday, I'm preaching at New Light Fellowship Church, I think is what it's called, in the Rainier area in Seattle. And my sermon there is titled Radical Inclusivity. And that sermon is literally going to be the first chapter of my book on decolonizing faith. That sermon and that chapter is looking directly at Jesus and the difference in his interactions between Jews and Samaritans, with whom he was radically inclusive, and Gentiles, who he held at arm's length. And it's looking at the difference in his interactions with those 2 demographics and asking, why is that the case? I'm not going to go into that right now. I'm going to go into a narrative that I'm wrestling with about the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, in Genesis, God, the divine, is introduced as creator. And we see the creation of Adam and Eve. We see creation of the world. We see the holding account for sin and misbehavior both with Adam and Eve and with their children as they're removed from the garden or sent off even further into the world. We see something very unique in the story of the flood, where God looks at the world and sees the sin of his creation. And I said his intentionally, I'll tell you why in a minute, and says, screw it, I'm going to kill everybody. As a native man, someone who knows Creator from more than just a book, someone who's watched the sunrise for almost half of my life, as someone whose people have been watching the sunrise for hundreds, even thousands of years, I can look definitively at that statement in Genesis where God says, I'm going to kill everybody, and I can assuredly tell you that's not Creator. That's not what Creator does. But in that book, that's what Creator does. At the end of that story, Creator makes a covenant, a promise with, again, I'm going to use the word his people. And what is that promise? Anyone remember? Close. I will never again destroy the world with a flood. So let's pretend we have some children in a room misbehaving. And the authority figure comes in, grabs a baseball bat, and just beats the crap out of them. Kills some of them. Just lays into them. And as this authority figure is leaving the room, puts a beautiful picture over the door and says, this picture is to remind me never to beat you with a bat again. Who's comforted? Not me. So the problem isn't the bat, right? That's not the problem here. Later, Creator becomes known as the God of Abraham. And the God of Abraham sees the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah and says, what? Screw it, I'm going to kill everybody. Now, Abraham's there and has family in Sodom and Gomorrah. He's like, hold on, God. If I can find 50, would you save it? Yes. If I can find 40, will you save it? If I can find 20, will you save it? If I can find 10, will you save it? Yes. I'm assuming Abraham knows the size of Lot's family and has negotiated God down to where he thinks he's like, okay, good, I saved him. Right? So God sends his angels in. They go into Lot. They meet Lot. He takes them into their house. The men of the city see these angels gone in there and say, hey, they knock on Lot's door and say, hey, let these men out. We want to have our way with them. Now, Lot says to the men of his city, don't, that's evil. But here, take my daughters, they're virgins. Just so we're not mincing words, Lot is pimping out his daughters. The next day, God decides to destroy the city, tells them to leave and not look back. As they're running, Lot's wife looks back, becomes a pillar of salt. Right? What's the lesson of that Sunday school story? Is it don't pimp out your daughters? No, it's don't look back, right? So we have a God who is more concerned about a woman who turns around than a man who pimps out his daughters. I'm troubled by that. That's deeply, deeply troubling. Later, God decides to test Abraham by asking him to do what? Kill his son. Later, the God of Abraham makes another covenant with Israel and becomes the God. So he was the God of a man. Now he's the God of Israel. Right? And Israel is in Egypt and they're being enslaved. God sends plagues upon the Egyptians. Oh, there's a whole lot we can talk about there with the killing of the firstborn and everything else. But let's go to Mount Sinai. The people on the top of Mount Sinai are outside, at the bottom of Mount Sinai. God is at the top giving his 10 commandments to Moses. And the people are getting restless because Moses is up there a long time. And they ask Aaron to make a golden calf, who they begin to worship. God sees this and says to Moses, depart from me, for my people are worshiping another God, and I'm going to kill them all. And Moses says, hold on, God. Let's think about this. Now, Moses doesn't appeal to God's love for his creation, for God's care for his people, even for God's covenant that he made with them. Moses appeals first and foremost to God's ego. The world saw you bring your people out of Egypt with a mighty hand. If you destroy them in the wilderness, they'll think it was with evil intent that you did these things. He appealed to God's ego. And it says, and God repented and did not bring upon the destruction of Israel as he had intended. Later they get to the banks of the Canaan River. And now God, who's been happy to do all the killing himself, and I have no problem calling the God of Abraham a he. The God of Abraham is absolutely patriarchal and misogynistic. If you don't believe me, just ask Lot's daughters. And now God says to his people, now I want you to do the killing. Leave nothing left alive. In the Psalms, the psalmist frequently asks God to do what to his enemies? Destroy them. The psalmist praises God when he's done what to his enemies? Destroyed them. We're now defining violence as love. There's only one group of people who see violence as love. It's those who've been groomed for abuse. In the book of 1 Samuel, the people ask God for a king. And Samuel laments and says, they rejected me as their judge. They want a king. And God says to Samuel, they're not rejecting you as their judge. They're rejecting me as their king. So God is now identifying God's self as king. We start with creator, move to the God of Abraham, move to the God of Israel, and eventually we get to king. The further we get from creator and the closer we get to king, the more violent, the more vindictive, the more genocidal, and the more abusive the character of God becomes. And these stories aren't just the Christian scriptures, right? This is the Torah. It's the first 5 books of the Bible. 3 faith traditions cling to these narratives, right? 3 faith traditions, the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims. In Gaza right now, we have a war going on. And there are 3 participants. Hamas, Israel, and the United States. Hamas has nationalized Islam, Israel has nationalized Judaism, and the United States has nationalized Christianity. All 3 of these faith traditions accept as scripture this narrative of creator to king, and accept as scripture this violence. They may debate it at different levels, but they all accept these stories as scripture. And all 3 of these faiths and all 3 of these nations have used these scriptures to justify absolutely inhumane treatment of their enemies in the name of their gods. And we're probably the worst of all 3 of them. And we think we're the voice of reason in that conflict. We're not the voice of reason in that conflict. This is why that war is so incredibly complex. Because the Abrahamic faith traditions all have this narrative that moves creator into king and accept these stories of violence, vindictive, abusive behavior as part of their scriptures. We have to find a way to have a discussion about that. The whole point of my book, Decolonizing Faith, is I want to cause a crisis in the church. We need to think and think deeply about what our scriptures say and ask ourselves, how willing are we to critique those scriptures? I'm writing this book not as a theologian. I have no desire to get into a theological battle with a bunch of old, dead white men. My whole point of writing this book, I'm writing this book as the son of boarding school survivors. My grandparents never had the opportunity to interrogate their faith. They never had an opportunity to interrogate the people who forced them to convert. And I want to lead that interrogation. Not because I want to reject my faith, but because I have to know. Good friend of mine, Raymond Miniacon, he's Aboriginal from Australia. He was in the US. I've known him for 20 plus years. He was in the US a few years ago at a Christian conference in Grand Rapids, and he was talking about the history of his people with the colonizers of Australia. End of his presentation, which was brilliant, he gets the question we all get, which is, why are you a Christian? The church has done horrible things to your people. Why do you follow this faith tradition? I've gotten this question numerous times. I like to turn the tables and say, well, why are you a Christian? If you know what your church has done, why do you still follow this faith that has done these horrible things? Raymond had a brilliant answer. He said, I'm a Christian because that's who colonized us. If we were colonized by Muslims, I'd be a Muslim. If we were colonized by Hindus, I'd be a Hindu. If we were colonized by Buddhists, I'd be a Buddhist. Christians colonized us. So I became a Christian. He said, but today I'm interrogating my faith because I have to know if this faith tradition is willing to acknowledge my full humanity as an Aboriginal man, or is it not? I asked him later, I said, Ray, I was blown away by his answer. I said, Ray, why did you use the word interrogate? Why not examine or investigate? He said, because those words are way too passive. I am putting this faith tradition on trial because I have to know if it's willing to acknowledge my humanity as an Aboriginal man. And that's what I'm doing with Decolonizing Faith. Again, I'm not trying to get into a debate with priests or with theologians or with seminary professors. I want to empower people in the pews to look at their leaders and say, he's not wrong. Why aren't we talking more about this? Why aren't we discussing these things more? Do you know why our Sunday school classes say that God saved Lot? Anyone remember? I looked it up, both from my own memory as well as I looked up Sunday school lessons online. Do you know why we teach God saved Lot, even though he pimped out his daughters? Because Lot was righteous. That's what we teach. Instead of being willing to tell our children that Lot pimped out his daughters, because that's why we don't teach it in Sunday school, because we want to use the word pimp to our kids. We tell them God saved Lot because Lot was righteous. That's not why God saved Lot. Do you know why God saved Lot? Because of Abraham. Was Abraham righteous? No. Tried to kill his son, raped Hagar, pimped out Sarah in Egypt. Abraham wasn't righteous. Why did God save Abraham? Because Abraham was faithful, and God credited that to him as righteousness. We have to be able to tell the truth about our scriptures and not be afraid to tell our children the honest truth about what these scriptures say and teach, and be willing to question these things. And I want to empower people in the pews to go to their priests and their leaders and their seminary professors and say, we have to talk about these things, because when you accept things without questioning them, that's what we call a cult. And when you define violent behavior as love, that's a symptom of abuse. So I absolutely want to cause a crisis in the church. And I want to invite the church into the same interrogation that Ray's on, the same interrogation that I'm on. And to have this discussion. Is the church willing to acknowledge the sum of our humanity? Or is it only accepting certain people who meet certain criteria, who act and behave in certain ways, or hold certain seats of power? I'm really, really excited about this book. If you want to get even some sneak previews into this, I have a Patreon site, which is a subscription site. I don't monetize most of my social media because I don't want to be beholden to advertisers in any way. But on Patreon, people can subscribe to you. And on my Patreon site, they have different tiers with different levels you can subscribe to. And I have one tier called Decolonizing Faith. And it's one of the more expensive tiers. It's $35 a month. But if you subscribe to it, even for just 1 month, it used to be called Unsettling Truths, and there's actually a 12-part book study I do with my co-author, Soong-Chan Rah, archived on that tier. And there's also a good 1.5 years of discussions I've had for the past 1.5 years about the content of decolonizing faith. I'm an extrovert, so I have to work these things out kind of verbally. So I use my Patreon as a way to kind of dialogue about these things before I start presenting them publicly. But yeah, there's a lot of I've been on Patreon for about 3 years, and there's a lot of really good places, really good ways to engage. They're also on my Patreon site. I have a monthly Q&A, open Q&A. So we're going to do a Q&A right after this, but I know I won't answer all your questions, and you'll probably have more questions tomorrow after you get some REM cycles in you, and your brain kind of filters through some of this. And you'll say, oh, I wish I could have asked this. Well, if you subscribe to my Patreon, even just for 1 month for the Q&A level, I do a Q&A every month. I'm going to do my one for December in about 1.5 weeks, I think. But anyway, those are just some things. But I'd love to, these are the things I'm working on. These are the things I'm passionate about. And I want to take some time now, if you have any questions, I'd love to answer any questions you may have or engage in any dialogue. We have a few minutes, and then we'll take a break, and you can get some snacks, and we can have more Q&A. And if you want to buy a book, you can do that too. But any questions people might have? Yes. I do not have time to go into depth on that. I actually do have a lot of critiques on capitalism. I live in one of the most socialist districts in the world. The U.S. or the District of Columbia is probably one of the most socialist places I've ever lived in my life, maybe except for the reservation. It's a fascinating place to be. Capitalism is a massive subject. I definitely have some critiques and some thoughts on it. I don't even know where to begin with this. What I would recommend is I do a podcast George mentioned earlier called My Second Cup of Coffee, and in that podcast, I talk about a lot of these issues a bit more frequently. You can follow me there. I'll just say one thing, and this is just a little teaser, not even of my thinking yet. But have anyone ever read the book by I forget his first name? Housel's his last name. The book is called The Psychology of Money. Anyone read that book? So in the afterword of that book, the end of the book, kind of the conclusion, he gives what I would call one of the best explanations, sort of not from a racial or from a faith perspective, but from a financial perspective of the rise of Trumpism. And just gives a brilliant breakdown, going all the way back to the Great Depression and moving forward to what he sees as some very key points that led to the rise of Trumpism. I think one of the huge problems we have with capitalism is capitalism assumes unlimited growth. That's not feasible. There is no natural system that can handle exponential unlimited growth. And one of the challenges we face as a nation is that we believe that, right, this exponential growth can happen. Our stock market's always going to keep growing. Who here uses AI? Anyone? Have you ever looked up the water cost of AI? It burns like 9 liters per kilowatt hour of water to cool these supercomputers. So one query to an AI, I read this morning, one query to an AI uses about 1 liter of water. Exponentially higher than a simple web query. I wouldn't even think about this, right? The amount of water that, plus all the water used to make the chips. I'm not saying we shouldn't be using AI, but, right, we live in this world where we think we can grow exponentially, and it's not feasible. But we also, right, so that's the right side of the argument. The left side believes that we can completely separate ourselves from it. If you ever Google the word nature, the definition of nature, nature is defined as all of the things in the natural environment separate from humans and human creation. Western society identifies itself as separate from the natural world. There's a documentary called Homeland. It's about Native nations fighting for the sovereignty of their homelands, and they look at the Athabascan tribe from northern Alaska in one of these segments. And the Athabascans live along the migratory route of the caribou. And the Athabascan creation story tells them that there's a piece of the Athabascan heart in the caribou and a piece of the caribou heart in the Athabascan. And they were interviewing one of the leaders of the people, and he was telling them that, yeah, we live along the migratory routes of the caribou. Every spring, they migrate north to calf, and every fall, they migrate south to winter. And he says it doesn't matter if we're in famine, if our people are starving, if we're in desperate times, we never hunt the caribou when they go north. And he said environmentalists and activists love us Because they're caring for the caribou. Look how great they are, the caribou. And then they're appalled when we freely hunt them when they go south. How can you kill the caribou? Like, we need their fur to keep us warm. We need their meat to nourish us. We're not separate. We need it. Now, we take it respectfully. We don't kill them in a way that's not sustainable, but we need them. There is a piece of us in them and a piece of them in us, and we have this relationship. Conservatives tend to think they can exploit the environment until it's gone, and liberals think they have to preserve the nature and everything, and they're somehow separate from it. They're not a part of the food chain. And neither one of those are accurate. If you study nutrition, right? You can't just take vitamin supplements. You will die. You have to chew your food. If you have a fruit smoothie every morning, you will get diabetes. That's going to jack up your blood sugar more than a soda. You don't just need to drink your nutrients, you have to chew your nutrients. You could drink 10 oranges in 5 minutes or 30 seconds. It would take you an hour to eat 10 oranges. And you get sick of it halfway through. You wouldn't even finish the last 5. But you can drink it in an orange juice cup in 30 seconds and jack up your blood sugar every single morning by drinking 100% pure orange juice. Right? We have to understand. We can't just, and this is what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow. We can't just reduce things down to their bare minimum and think because we understand this, we understand the whole. And so, yeah, I could go off on the questions about the economy, but for you to what? Yeah. I'm very busy the next few days, but I have the event in Rainier Avenue Church tomorrow, and I have another one at New Light Fellowship Sunday morning. So yeah, I don't have a lot of time outside of that, unfortunately. But yeah. One more question maybe before we end. Yes, sir. I don't think so. Just like if anyone tells you they don't have a bias, don't trust them. Right? We all have a bias. It's not that we can't have an odd flow, but if we're not aware of what they are, that's where it becomes problematic. And so if people know what their bias is, or at least have an idea of how their bias is, what it is, that's a healthy thing. And our goal is not to be unbiased. We can't be unbiased. We have bias. And so I think it helps if we're aware of what they are, so that we can see the limitations and so that we can bring other inputs and people around us to help fill in the gaps or give us different perspectives or different understandings of things. But yeah, do not think it's possible to have an unflawed theological imagination. I mean, the whole point of an imagination, right? It's kind of expand your thinking. And so I think we just have to understand, yeah, we're all going to have some flaws in our thinking, which is why we need community. It's why we need checks and balances. It's why we need people around us to help fill in the gaps where I think we're going to be limited in our insight and in our understanding. Appreciate that question. I want to thank one more, okay? Mhm. I don't disagree. I think the challenge I would, as I've encountered that perspective before, the challenge I see, especially here in the United States, and my co-author in the book Unsettling Truths, Soong-Chan Rah, addresses this brilliantly, both in the book and other places, where we as a nation and the Western European and the American church struggle deeply with the notion of lament. With lament. And many people think lament is confession or repentance. It's not. Lament is sitting in the brokenness. Soong-Chan Rah, my co-author, wrote a book just before we wrote our book together called Prophetic Lament. And in that book, he refers lament to, it's like a funeral dirge. You don't go to a dirge to raise someone from the dead. You go there to mourn their death, to mourn their loss. And the challenge we have, right, when you live in a nation that believes in the myth of its own exceptionalism, there's no space to lament. Everything has to end in triumphalism. But in the scriptures, and we can't even get through a Good Friday service without ending with triumphalism. We are anemic at lament. And because of that, when the people of God lament in the scriptures, and they lament all the time, God always shows up. Every single time God shows up. But God always waits longer than the people of God are comfortable with. And because the American church is so anemic at lament, we never stay in lament long enough to meet God there. And when God does show up, God always offers a perspective and a solution and a path forward that is much more challenging as well as much more rewarding than that what was envisioned before. But it's going to take a much higher level of commitment. And if we don't understand the depth of the problem, we're not going to be willing to put in the energy to get to the place of where we need to be. And so I really try to, I don't, and again, I'm not trying just to beat us down, but what I am trying to do is to saying, yeah, we have to hear these things and wrestle with them deeply and the depth of them, because fixing these problems are going to be absolutely challenging and hard. And if we're not geared up for how challenging it's going to be, we're not going to make it through to the work that needs to be done. And that's what I'm really trying to encourage people to do with this. That's why we wrote this book. It was no mistake that Soong-Chan wrote Prophetic Lament before we wrote this book. So I don't want to just dismiss it, but I want to, before we turn too quickly to there's a bright side, and I don't disagree, there is a bright side. But if we don't allow ourselves to wrestle with the depth of the brokenness first, that's going to diminish the brightness when we get there. And that's what I'm trying to do with the work that I'm engaged in right now. I really appreciate your comment. Thank you for bringing that up. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. This has been wonderful to be with you. So thank you so much. I'm happy I have some books in the back. If anyone would like to buy a book or just ask more questions, I'm happy to continue engaging in conversation. And again, we have these two more events, one tomorrow night at 6:30 at Rainier Avenue Church, and one, I think it's called New Light Fellowship Church at 11 a.m. on Sunday morning. So you're welcome to come to those if you'd like to. Thank you, everybody. And if you want to get this QR code on here, oh, one other thing, just for those who want, I also offer with my books what I call a book study special, where if you buy 10 signed copies of my book, either from me here tonight or on my website, and I ship them for free from my website, so you want to pay shipping either way. But if you buy 10 copies of my book for the purpose of a book study, I will give your book study a free 45-minute virtual Q&A up to a year after the study that you can schedule with my assistant. And so it's a great way to basically get the book, get into the hands of 10 members of your church or your friends, and then say, hey, we can also have a Q&A with the author during or after the study is over. So you can order that from me tonight, or you can order it from my website. If you go to this QR code, a lot of the links I talked about and resources I gave you are available on this QR code, including where you can buy the book from. So thank you all very much.
I'm Daryl Whiteman,
Hi, Daryl.
and I'm the publisher of the American Society of Missiology.
Oh!
I'm the guy that gave you guys.
Yeah, thank
Are
you.
you aware of that?
Yeah, I did. I knew we had it, but I didn't know that you were with them. That's yeah,
So,
yeah.
so I got your book and read it along with about 10 other